Start talking about now is we're going to start looking at the parts of the actual brain, the different lobes of it, and what is going on in each of those, and kind of more of our functional areas. So if you remember from last semester, there's really three different functions when you're talking about nervous tissue: motor functions, sensory functions, and then integration functions. So what we will do is we'll work through the parts of the cerebrum, for example, first in those areas. So what I want to introduce here to start with is really just kind of what are the different parts of the brain, and then talk a little bit about the lobes of the cerebrum, and then from there we will do another couple of episodes there that are going to be looking at what are the different functional areas within that cerebrum. So if we're looking at the brain here, so this is a mid-sagittal slice of the brain. So you can see the interior. You can see the cerebrum in terms of the size of it is one of the largest. It has about half the neurons, but that is also because there's a lot more white matter taking up the space in there. Again, on that one, the other about half of the neurons are in the cerebellum, this structure back here. To me, that when you slice it looks like cauliflower. We then have the diencephalon and the brainstem. Those are the four main brain regions that we're going to be talking about. The most obvious of those ones is the cerebrum. The cerebrum, again, when you think about what makes you, it is going to really be what's going on in your cerebrum. So most of your actual functions, so most of your voluntary motor kind of control coming from the cerebrum. Most of your sensation taking place in the cerebrum. All the good chunk of processing in terms of thoughts, conscience, memory, all that also in here, intelligence, reasoning power, all within the cerebrum. Is again, to me, the most obvious part of the brain. When you see a brain, it is the one that's really the biggest portion you'll see. You can see images of it here. It is that wrinkled with the gyri and sulci. That's quite obvious. Again, composed of two halves separated by a deep cleft down the center called the longitudinal or median longitudinal fissure. Hemispheres are for the most part separate. There is a few commissural tracts or bundles of axons that are connecting the two sides. We'll talk about these different tract types in a little bit, but we do have some white matter doing that. The largest one of those is that corpus callosum. It is the biggest band of white matter that connects the two hemispheres of the brain. So you can see, again, two hemispheres here and here, that longitudinal fissure down the center. That corpus callosum is this big band of white matter, really the largest band of white matter connecting the two hemispheres. And you can see it zoomed in a little bit on this one, how it's connecting those. Again, a lot of the brain is kind of interesting. Again, one of the things I always like to talk about is so many movies and other things like that. We'll talk about, talk about what percentage of your brain you're using. Oh, and then the movie Lucy, we opened up 100% of our brain and she could control things and stuff like that. The one with Bradley Cooper that I can't remember the name of right now unlocks more of his brain and all of a sudden he's like the smartest person ever. The percentage you use of your brain right now is 100% of your brain. As I've said a number of times, most things in the body are use it or lose it. Nervous tissue is one of, at least energetically, one of the most expensive types of tissue to have in terms of how much energy it uses. Because of that, you're not going to have large numbers of neurons that you're not ever using. So we are using all these ones. The other thing is we use so many of these things that if there is damage to certain structures, like let's say in your eye when you're born, and you don't end up using the area that's normally associated with visual, the brain will co-opt that and expand on other stuff or use it in other areas. So there is some plasticity in the brain, especially when you're younger. There is a lot of ability to co-opt certain regions if something isn't right, or you can have sometimes a hemispherectomy and these people can develop normally. So there is ways to have some plasticity, this ability to swap out what brain regions would normally be doing, but that plasticity is generally early on in life, and by the time you're to college age or my age, if you were to lose part of a cerebral cortex, you're generally not going to be able to have other regions take that over. Because of this, it's kind of messy in terms of where certain things are at. There's some overlapping functions on these edges. The boundaries are not incredibly distinct, But that being said, they have been able with different like types of MRI scans with trackers. You can do these things called PET scans that you can see which cells are being active, which ones are consuming more glucose under certain conditions. So we have been able to kind of dial in a little bit what brain regions are doing what in terms of where certain things are at, like facial recognition or something like that, for example. Again, not going to be 100% always the same person to person in terms of what exact area that's in, though. The other interesting thing with the cerebrum is innervation. It's sending right side of the brain is controlling and getting sensory information from the left side of the body, and the vice versa is also true. There is a crossing over of all these tracks in kind of the brain stem, in that medulla. The other thing we're going to see is there is certain times that certain regions of the brain we have control. A lot of times the site on the right side of the brain for the left side of the body, you'll see it in the same spot on the left side of the brain for the right side of the body. There is certain things that are lateralized, meaning they're only on one side of the brain. Speech, for example, tends to be less left hemisphere. In some people it's right hemisphere, very few, but some of the brain regions responsible for language tend to be left hemisphere only. There is also some other higher order stuff that can be lateralized a little bit. If you're right-handed or left-handed, your brain structure tends to look a little bit different. So again, the cerebrum, again, that large part here, gray matter on the exterior, just on those outer kind of 4 or 5 millimeters. Then white matter mainly in through the rest of that. You can see that on the surface right here, gray matter right along here, white matter all on the interior. Lots of gyri and sulci. There's going to be a few prominent sulci that are more obvious. These are what are going to divide us up into our different lobes of the cerebrum. So the cerebrum, like I was just saying, you have those fissures that separate the left and right half, but you do have some deep sulci, like the central sulcus, the temporal sulcus. These are separating some of these main regions of the brain into the 5 different lobes of the hemisphere. So the 5 different lobes, for the most part, they're named based on the bones that are above them. So frontal lobe is underneath the frontal bone. Parietal lobes are really mainly underneath the parietal bones. Temporal lobes underneath the temporal bone. Occipital lobe underneath the occipital bone. The insula is the one that's a little bit more difficult. So if we're looking at these here, kind of the main sulcus, the deepest sulcus you'll see on the brain is called the central sulcus. It's right here on this. In front of that would be the frontal lobe. Behind that, at least up here, would be the parietal lobe. You can see this main sulcus right here. That's dividing that from that temporal lobe down here, and the occipital lobe is in the back. So again, it's some of these main prominent sulci that are making the difference here. So that's that lateral sulcus right here. The occipital sulcus is a little bit harder to see, but it's on the back of the brain here. We don't really see it because we're not seeing the posterior side of the brain here. Again, 4 of these are visible on the surface and named for the bones that are above them. Like I was already saying, the insula is kind of this area of gray matter that's tucked in underneath kind of those temporal lobe flaps. We'll see that in just a minute here. And a lot of these are very kind of specific a little bit on what they're doing. Certain association areas, certain control regions or sensory regions, we're going to see are localized to particular lobes, at least for the vast majority of people. Like I said, some brains are different. So you can see the frontal lobe, the insula, that's what I was kind of saying. You see here's the temporal lobe would be right out here. You can see there's this little area of the sulci going deep, and then there is this area of gray matter surrounding this opening. That is that insula. So it's inside or insulated within the brain. That's where it gets its name. So the frontal lobe is in front of that central sulcus and a kind of the lateral sulcus here. This is doing a lot of motor functions. So lots of motor planning and primary motor cortex. Also a lot of your logic, your thinking, your personality, decision-making, planning. Most of that is in that frontal lobe and actually what we call the prefrontal cortex. And you can see the frontal lobe right here, that sulcus. Parietal lobe is behind that, underneath the parietal bone. Really ends at the occipital sulcus in the back. So it's that postcentral gyrus, the occipital sulcus, down to that transverse, or excuse me, that lateral sulcus on the temporal one there. I'll show you a picture in just a second. Doing mainly sensory functions, a lot of what we would call somatosensory, so kind of those heat, cold, touch, all that stuff we talked about in AP1, that it would be kind of the general senses, is really taking place in this lobe, as well as a lot of association cortexes. So a lot of the primary sensory cortex, for example, it's receiving the cells that receive that sensation back. A lot of the other regions there are actually association areas that are processing that information and processing information from other areas of the brain, saying overall what happened. So giving you more of a perception of what happened versus how pain on my toe versus, oh, I stepped on a tack, therefore my toe hurts. And you can see here, again, occipital sulcus right back here. It's kind of that central sulcus to there. And like I said, the lateral sulcus on the side is really defining where that one's at. Temporal lobe is beneath that lateral sulcus. It's doing a lot of hearing and sense in terms of hearing and smell, in terms of the sensory information coming back, as well as, again, some processing areas for those. And again, you can see it right there. And then finally, the occipital lobe is in the back. It is really doing most everything with visual processing, as well as things with facial recognition, putting images to words, as you're going to see, is kind of in between that and the temporal lobe, generally found on the left side of the brain only. But the occipital lobe is the last one here, again, underneath that occipital bone on the back of the brain. You might think it's weird. It seems like it's a long ways from the eyes if your eyes are on the front and this back here, but actually the distance is quite short. So it's actually pretty close for those optic nerves going back. And you can see that on this image right here. The insula, like I said, is if you go in that lateral sulcus and find that little internal region where there's gray matter, it is doing some of your memory and taste perception. It's involved with that. Also some of your like kind of visceral type of sensations of like disgust, like if you see something like rotten food or smell rotten food or something, that might be triggered from there. And you can see it on the interior right here. So that lateral sulcus going deep here, and then you have this internal space. That is that insula. So you can see, again, all these on this cartoon image. Again, you can't see the insula because it's interior. And again, the way these are laid out is gray matter on the exterior, white matter on the interior. In the cerebral cortex, it's about half of your neurons are found in the cerebrum. Again, out in that outer layer. There is actually some distinct layers to this. If you get really into it, they kind of talk about there being 6 distinct layers of the cerebrum up at the gray matter there. Again, they are not super distinct. Even in my histology course, I don't try to have them differentiate this. I just have them try to identify that it is cerebrum. Again, the cerebral cortex is going to have these main areas. So you're going to have motor functions, sensory functions, and association functions. And that's really where we're going to spend a lot of the time from here on out, is going through what are the different motor regions of the brain? Where do we find them? What are they doing? Where are they located? Same thing with sensory and some of the sensory association areas. And then overall integration areas. What are these main integration areas that we see? That's what we'll do on the next little bit here with the cerebral cortex, and then we'll work through some of those other brain regions like the diencephalon, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. So that's what we're going to be looking at next. I will see you then.